to make. My name is Yaqub Aba Omar. I'm the Director Operations at the Mapungubwe Institute. We want to encourage you to use the Q&A function. It's a very, you'd be surprised how quickly the time is going to run out. So make sure you start getting in your questions now. We also want you to be using the various social media platforms. As far as X, or formerly Twitter, use MISTRA, all caps, and then underscore SA. MISTRA, and then underscore SA. As far as Facebook and LinkedIn is concerned, look at Mapungubwe Institute for Strategic Reflection. And then we have 3 hashtags. One is hashtag 50 Days of Trump. And I know sometimes it doesn't feel like it was 50 days. It feels like 100 days, if not longer. And then hashtag Trump administration. And then hashtag MISTRA Webinar. Okay, so I'm going to start off by introducing our first speaker, and that is Dr. Sandy Africa, who's the Director of Research at MISTRA, and she's going to provide the scene setting for today's webinar. Over to you, Sandy.
Thank you, Program Director, Dr. Aba Omar, and good day to everybody, and welcome again for joining us today. Welcome, and thank you for joining us, and greetings, of course, to our distinguished panel of speakers. We really are looking forward to your contributions. So I have a few introductory words, just explaining, how we approach the setting up of this webinar, which we hope will contribute to public debates, which have been raging quite furiously on what has happened since President Donald Trump assumed office earlier this year. And of course, we accepted, as we were thinking about it, that Trump's election and the Republican Party's success in the polls in November last year were the result of a democratic process. But we saw also that these elections were highly contested and have led to policy changes with implications for South Africa and the African continent. Perhaps what we were quite taken aback by were how they've impacted even traditional Western allies of the USA. So in these analyses, it's been pointed out that Trump's actions were the basis of his election campaign. So his executive acts, his decrees, his orders shouldn't really surprise us. And just to rattle off a few, since his swearing in, we've seen actions such as the following: mass expulsion of undocumented migrants from the USA, the withdrawal of foreign aid to countries around the world, threats to acquire other countries like Greenland, and to make Canada a 51st state of the United States. Pressure on US allies, European allies particularly, to take greater responsibility for their defense and security, and demands that what many assumed would be the country that the US would back, demands that Ukraine, in a way, pay back the money for the support it received during the war with Russia. And of course, raging in the public media, analyses on the stiff tariffs on imports from friends and foe alike, and what this might mean. So many are asking, should these actions, should these executive decisions be seen as an aberration in American politics, after which the proverbial pendulum will swing back to normal, with the US reverting to using its military might and its soft power to take up the mantle of leader of the free world once again? Or is the US administration really growing disenchanted with globalization and global supply chains? And is it increasingly keen to build walls to go it alone, or at least on its own terms, at the same time taking on less responsibility for the world's troubles? In other words, as we look at all these actions, and there have been literally scores of these executive orders and decisions, Is there a grand strategy? In a world characterized by a decentering of power, a redistribution of power among fewer states, but also the involvement of non-state actors in global governance and making of big decisions, or at least shaping them, it wouldn't be a surprise if this is in fact all part of a grand strategy. And what is that strategy? We'd like perhaps our speakers to help us understand what that might be. But that's at the international level. If we look at developments in domestic politics in the US, where, for example, the shutting down of government departments in the name of efficiency, the release of people convicted for their crimes in the January the 6th insurrection, the firing of senior government officials, including strategic appointments in the security establishment, the repudiation of diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives, the reversal of gender rights. Are these two an aberration? After which we are likely to see liberal norms and values becoming prominent again? Or all of these indicative of long-term political, economic, and ideological trends with the performative political style of President Donald Trump, just bringing them to our TV and phone screens in a manner that is unprecedented in its force and impact. And so these were the questions that we were asking ourselves as we were identifying and approaching speakers to share their perspectives with us today. Because we thought it would be useful to analyze what is happening to American institutions and whether the checks and balances, which we thought or were told to be the bedrock of the political system, are in fact functioning, and what the prognosis is for these institutions and these checks and balances, and what this means for US society. We wanted to understand the exact and apparent role of big tech in US politics. I suppose we could characterize them as a non-state actor, and the way in which traditional institutions of governance are being challenged by informal sources of power. This is the shape of things to come. We wanted also to assess the geopolitical implications of the changes in administration and what they mean for international security. All our gazes are fixated on Ukraine and Russia, but we know that there are also other conflicts playing out where the US, to varying degrees, is involved or directing or having an inordinate amount of influence in the way things play out. And we wanted to reflect on the changes in policy and their implications for South Africa and African countries at several levels in terms of foreign policy that will need to be calibrated, trade relations, and even people-to-people relations. So MISTRA has been researching many of these issues and reflecting on Africa and South Africa's place in the world for as long as MISTRA has been in existence. And I could remind you that its last edited collection on this very theme of Africa's place in the world was published in 2022 under the title Reflections on Africa's Place in the World. And it follows other edited collections assessing Africa's challenges and opportunities in the shifting geopolitical terrain. And last year, as our program director has mentioned, MISTRA hosted a successful conference where the core question asked was whether the world is witnessing a power transition where the hegemony of a once powerful state is being challenged by a new contender, or whether we are gravitating towards a multipolar global order where the traditional institutions that came into being after World War II are increasingly being challenged or supplemented by new forms of pooled sovereignty, regional organizations, new financing instruments, new alliances built on economic cooperation, and all this in the context of the emergence of rising powers such as BRICS, of which South Africa is an element. Now, African countries, some being heavily dependent on foreign aid, have felt the consequences of the suspension of grants from the US. But beyond this, it may be that the US has not pronounced very directly on its foreign policy intentions for South Africa and how Africa fits into its grand strategy, if there's one. And perhaps this reflects that Africa doesn't feature too high up in the US's priorities, and it would be good to hear the ambassador's views on this proposition. But if that's the case, this may mean that African countries, individually and collectively, may well have time to observe, to take stock of the unfolding situation and plot various scenarios, identifying potential sources of complementarity with the US as it recalibrates itself, but also friction, and working out how best to navigate them. So, Program Director and our very esteemed audience, it's in this context that this webinar is taking place, and we're looking forward to the insights that will be shared by the speakers and to your contributions to the conversation thereafter. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sandy Africa. We couldn't have asked for a better person to set the scene for this webinar. Before I invite the first speaker to address us, just a reminder that at the end of the webinar, we will be showing a video of a conference that we held last year. And I think those of us that were there and the speakers that were involved, I see a number of you are in this audience. We can pat ourselves on the back for having been quite prescient in identifying the kind of issues that we are now confronting and the kind of strategies that are possible for Africa. So if you're not in a rush, please wait till the end and we'll put the film on at that point. It now gives me great pleasure to call upon Ambassador Ibrahim Rasool to address us. As you know, he's the South African ambassador to the United States of America, and this is his second term there. I'm not going to go into all his background. I think many of you know him very well for all the work he's done in various aspects. One of the positions was as chair of DBSA in the Western Cape. He played many roles, etc., etc. Ambassador, thank you very much for waking up at this unearthly time. And I know, especially during the month of Ramadan, we appreciate your presence here. Over to you.
No, thank you very much, Dr. Abba Omar, and to MISTRA and my fellow panelists, and to everyone who is, for some or other reason, not productively employed and filling up your audience base. I want to say that I've got fairly limited time to get through quite a lot. So I'm going to cut out a lot of elegance. I may get misunderstood in the process, but I'm asking you to give me the benefit of the doubt and then to voice your questions afterwards. But I want to start with an issue of perspective, because how South Africa responds to this current relationship with the USA is going to demand quite a lot of perspective from us. So the first perspective I want to share is the idea that foreign policy, like other policies, is like a telescope. It has two lenses, a lens of your values and a lens of your interests. And often a country makes its policies based on what lens it keeps against its eye and then views the other lens through that. I think South Africa has by and large held the lens of values to its eye and then viewed its interest and calibrated its interest through that lens. I think that there are definitely countries who would invert the telescope and put their interest against their eyes and then calibrate their values. So that's the first perspective I think that we must keep in mind as we navigate this relationship. And so if we understand that our values are the fundamental beliefs that shape our understanding of what is right, what is important, and what is desirable, whereas our interests are those matters that are important and necessary to bring good and benefit to our society, then I think we have something that we work with. And in fact, I would recommend that some of us get hold of this publication that is the framework document of South Africa's national interests, because this is going to be an absolutely crucial guide for us during these very turbulent moments that we are navigating between our values and our interests. And if we accept, as this framework document says, that national interests are those interests that are based on strategic ones, where our goals and objectives that are needed for our nation's economy and security, well-being, that it would consist by and large of matters, for example, of defense that protect our nation, matters of economy that ensure the well-being of our nation, matters of the world order interests, in which we need a global system that facilitates our mutual protection and well-being with other countries, and that we also have ideological interest to advance the values for universal good. Now, if we accept those things as the perspectives of departure and the lenses, literally and figuratively, through which we view things, then maybe as we go through this conversation, we can begin to make sense of our navigational tasks. So the second broad issue that I want to raise is, what is this current moment in the US political life? I think in doing this, it is going to be useful for us to recognize the many continuities in the Trump administration that is inherited from the Biden administration. And so, for example, it was Biden that started putting pressure under his regime, that started, for example, putting pressure on AGOA for South Africa as a result of some of our geopolitical stances. It's a continuity from the Biden administration, where the resistance to the emerging multipolarity in the world started to be articulated. And it is from the Biden administration that we saw the very frenetic attempts to maintain US ideological hegemony, particularly in the way in which it armed, for example, Ukraine and Israel for that hegemony. So I want to say that we mustn't miss, through a obsession with Donald Trump, we must not miss the continuities from the Biden administration. But there are significant discontinuities, I think, that we must also understand from the Trump administration, and very clearly in the discontinuities, there is a disrespect for the institutional base of the current hegemonic order. We see that in the way in which the Russian negotiations are being conducted, that has very little of, as a healthy disrespect for NATO, the sense about whether the UN, the United Nations, is as important, the bypassing of monies from the US, from the World Bank, IMF, etc., etc. So I think there's clearly that as a clear discontinuity. And I think it's also in our interest to watch whether that disrespect will persist and be sustained on the issue of the G20, especially because we need to hand over from South Africa to the US the presidency of the G20. The second discontinuity is almost that I think what Donald Trump is launching is an assault on incumbency, those who are in power, by mobilizing a supremacism against the incumbency at home, and I think I've illustrated abroad as well. So in terms of that, the supremacist assault on incumbency, we see it in the domestic politics of the USA, the MAGA movement, the Make America Great Again movement, as a response, not simply to a supremacist instinct, but to very clear data that shows great demographic shifts in the USA, in which the voting electorate in the USA is projected to become 48% white, and that the possibility of a majority of minorities is looming on the horizon. And so that needs to be factored in so that we understand some of the things that we think are instinctive, nativist, racist things. I think that there's data that, for example, would support that, that would go to this wall being built, the deportation movement, etc., etc. So I think I mentioned that. I think that there is also an export of the revolution. It's no accident that that Elon Musk has involved himself in UK politics and elevated a Nigel Farage and the reform movement in much the same way that it was instructive that on his way to the Munich Security Summit, Vice President Vance addressed the Alternative für Deutschland to strengthen them in their election campaign. And that then begins to say, what was the role then of Afrikaners in that whole makeup? And very clearly, it's to project white victimhood as a dog whistle, that there is a global protective movement that is beginning to envelop embattled white communities, or apparently embattled white communities. It may not be true, it may not make sense, but that is not the dog whistle that is being heard in a global white base. So I think we need to understand all of that. Another discontinuity, it's almost that they are putting a supremacist insurgency against the incumbency, and therefore we need to rethink our old categories of rationalization, because in that category, there are mainstream Republicans like Mitt Romney and so forth that are seen as part of the incumbency that are also embattled. And so it's an intra-party insurgency as well as a global insurgency and a national one in the USA. So I think we've got to get out of categories of thinking that are falling by the wayside, and it's forcing critical transitions in the world. This idea of undermining incumbency, it's firing and forcing transitions from a system where the incumbents violated rules and disregarded rules to one where there are minimal to no rules and conventions that are at play at home or abroad. It's a transition from soft impunity to hard impunity, in-your-face impunity. It's a transition from rules-based duress to punitive coercion, naked punitive coercion as the currency of exchange. And it's a way to deal with emerging multilateralism and shifting, for example, from a focus on BRICS, where Trump and Biden administration was very obsessed with BRICS as the locus of the multilateral movement emerging, to Trump being an equal opportunity engager, using power over the whole world, using economic power particularly. So I think that's what we are able to discern from this side. So the third issue that I then want to raise is, what is this power? What is this power that is being exercised? And I think the power exercised is of the shock and awe variety. It is one of the South Africans that are here in that kind of inner circles of MAGA, wrote the book, The Agenda, in which Joel Pollack, for example, speaks about the 200, I think, executive orders that must be prosecuted within the first 100 days. Abba, are you telling me I just have 2 minutes left? Okay, so let me let me choose what I then end up on. Let me summarize that one. I think the shock and awe is being exercised across the USA. We've seen Doge at work. We've seen the borders. We've seen the attack on DEI and wokeism, and we've seen social cuts in the USA. Secondly, at a global level, we all know that the stopping of aid and assistance, the multilateral financing system is brought down through, for example, anything that sounds like climate, like the JETP. The trade and tariffs is dominating the agenda, and the geopolitical. And then South Africa fits into that. We are not unique in all of that, but we fit into that because we are the historical antidote to supremacism, the success story of it. Our GNU, it's underappreciated in South Africa, but our GNU is seen as the second miracle of the democratic era in South Africa, that we accepted the defeat, that the ANC did so and formed the government of national unity, etc. So what are the strategic dilemmas and choices that I think we face? I think we have what is called the hot button issues, Israel and the ICJ, the Afrikaner issues, BRICS and the de-dollarization, China and Taiwan and the liaison office, the allegation of Iran funding, and the Russia-Ukraine thing is receding on that. And then there's the bread and butter economics, like the aid budgets that slashed 8 billion from South Africa at the very least, the tariffs and trade that I think we're being threatened with. AGOA comes into that very quickly. And then the question is, what are the interventions that I think we are looking at from the US? Again, in summary, in elegant form, let me mention 6 quick ones. The first thing is stay calm and don't panic. I know there's a lot of panic being engendered because they see delegations coming to the US and saying, when is the president sending his envoys? I think we've got to let the pushback and the walk back mature in the USA and see what the town hall meetings are doing to next year's electoral projections, because that may do half the work that we think some of our envoys can be doing. And we do it too early, we give a distraction to the pushbacks and the walkbacks. Secondly, the Afrikaner issue creates outrage in South Africa, but it has created enormous self-mobilization behind South Africa. It consolidates our African base. It returns old allies who were disenchanted, for example, with our Israel position or our Russia. They're coming back. They're saying, no, the attack on you is more important. This Afrikaner thing is ludicrous. And they're bringing in new allies, like, from example, Europe, are rallying to us. So again, don't panic in South Africa about it. It's working in our favor in the USA. Thirdly, we're engaging the lawmakers and we're putting in deposits so that when fear subsides of the White House, we have planted the alternative view. So we're doing that kind of seed-laying work. The fourth one is, let other formations that are coming here have their say. Let's absorb it. And they're not seeing high-level people, but they are high-level social media pushers. And therefore, let's absorb that message and respond comprehensively, not toe-to-toe, because that's the fight that we must avoid as the official voice of South Africa. Fifthly, let's hold, as in rugby, let's hold our impact players back, like our envoys and so forth. Because you don't come to empty doors. The administration is not yet filled. In State Department, there is no Africa division in place, no Assistant Secretary for Africa, Undersecretary. You're knocking on empty doors. The USTR has just been appointed. There's no Africa USTR. You're knocking on empty doors. So you've got to wait for a reasonable filling of those doors before you knock. Secondly, Don't come empty-handed. Be ready to deal. Don't come and say, oh, we want to discuss this and explain to you. There's no room for explanation. You saw the Zelensky effect. If you prevaricate, you're a loser. You've got to come here knowing what's your top line, what's your middle line, what's your bottom line, and then put it forward as a negotiating strategy. Otherwise, you're a loser in this, and you're subject to the Zelensky effect. Secondly, or finally, manage the G20 handover, salvage that baby from the bathwater, because the healthy disrespect for global institutions may just, if we play our cards right, be the way in which, when we hand over to Donald Trump after 4 years of global South leadership of the G20, there may be possibly one president that could reform some of the global architecture because he has a healthy disrespect for it. And so let us hope that in the idea of a broken clock being right twice a day, that we are able to manage how we do that. I'm very sorry that I went, according to my watch, 2 minutes over time, but I'm hoping that there's enough forgiveness in the month of Ramadan. Thank you very much.
Not only is there forgiveness, I'm getting unpopular. People are telling me, allow the ambassador to speak more for longer. But colleagues on the call, the ambassador also wants to hear what our concerns are. And so please put your questions in. I think some of you are saying there are specific issues that you'd like to raise. So put that in and we will come back to that. It now gives me great pleasure to invite the next speaker, who's probably one of those people that's in the crosshairs of this whole thing, given what we've spoken about PEPFAR and USAID and the work that you are doing as far as HIV/AIDS is concerned. So it gives me a great pleasure, Professor Linda Gale Becker, who's the CEO and co-founder of the Desmond Tutu Health Foundation. Over to you, Linda. I'm sorry, I'm not going to be as lenient with you. So over to you. Thank you.
That's fine. Thank you, Dr. Abba. And I, it's a great honor to follow Ambassador. And I agree, we need to keep things short so we can hear more from the panel as a whole. So my role in this particular webinar is really to show manifestation of some of the the acts that have occurred in the last 50 days of the Trump administration, and in particular in the health sector around HIV funding. So many of you will have heard that as part of the USAID pullback, dissemination, complete removal of USAID really from the United States of America, the PEPFAR funding has fallen casualty. So I thought I would really start by reflecting on where we have come from and what the PEPFAR funding was about, just so we're all on the same level playing field, then describe what has happened and what the possible impact of this is, and potentially where I think we may need to go. So we know that around the world, this epidemic, now 40 odd years old, has been one of the greatest public health challenges in the last 100 years in the world. It is a global pandemic. There are today around 40 million people living with HIV, of which we know there are 10 million who have not been reached for treatment, care, and access to antiretroviral therapy. We also know that in the last year, 1.3 million people became newly infected with HIV, and 130,000 children were born with HIV or became infected in their sort of neonatal period. So the first point I want to make is this epidemic is far from over. Now, our region has borne the brunt of the epidemic. 21 million people, women, live with HIV around the world. The vast majority of them are here in our region in East and Southern Africa. We still see in our own country 50,000 deaths every year, 150,000 new infections. And although we have made incredible progress in the epidemic, we really are entering now what we have termed the last mile. And I do want to say PEPFAR, and that name stands for the President's Emergency Fund for AIDS Relief, was born in 2003 in a very dark time in our own history as regards this epidemic. It was a time when we had an administration that denied that HIV was the cause of AIDS and the cause of why people were dying. Antiretrovirals had been discovered. We did know that antiretrovirals could control the infection in individuals and convert the disease into a chronic disorder whereby people would be able to again live a normal lifespan. So we went from a time where our lifespans actually dropped by about 10 years. We were seeing upwards of 3,000 people infected every week. And of course, we just saw an enormous increase in mortality, morbidity, our hospitals filled, and a 6-fold increase in our tuberculosis rate. So it's also important to realize that HIV tracks with tuberculosis. And of course, this region is an epicenter for both HIV and TB. So today, South Africa has not only the biggest HIV burden of any country in the world, but happily, we have come a long way and we now have the biggest treatment program of any country in the world. When PEPFAR was born in 2003, it really was a response to the devastation that was occurring in the southern eastern region of Africa. People were not able to access antiretrovirals due to cost, and the then Republican leader, the administration at the time, George W. Bush, asked a simple question: why are the people dying in southern Africa? And it was said they do not have access to antiretroviral therapy. So the emergency fund was commenced, and subsequently billions of US dollars have come to this region and to other PEPFAR countries and has really turned the epidemic around. Now, in 2003, South Africa was 100% dependent on PEPFAR to actually access antiretrovirals. Over the last 30 years, 25 odd years, we have seen that flip. So now our national fiscus picks up 80% of the HIV response. And as I've mentioned, we now have the biggest treatment program in the world. Having said that, we still need to find about 1 to 2 million people in the country who've never accessed antiretrovirals. There are those individuals who have, for whatever reason, cycled out of care. And of course, today we know that one of the most important responses is actually primary prevention. So what has PEPFAR been doing in the last few years, and what had we hoped it would do in the next 5 years? So the HIV world, including ourselves here in South Africa, have 2030 as a very important goal. 2030 is a goal that UNAIDS has put in front of us. Of course, the SDGs are there. And the idea was that we really bring to bear our best efforts around treatment, trying to get everybody, and this is where the 95-95 come in, to get everybody on to care, get primary prevention going with the goal to bringing this epidemic under control by 2030, and thereby really creating a sustainable program that would take us into a manageable epidemic going forward. We are in that sort of 5-year period now where we were transitioning to taking our program on fully, but the PEPFAR dollars have been helping us get to that point. They have employed those individuals to find the individuals that are not in care, to bring them in, to provide primary prevention. And of course, all of that has now been really removed in an overnight kind of way. And so I do think we as a health sector in the country, both governmental and non-governmental, are having to acutely come up with a plan that fills those gaps urgently and says, how will we, ensure that we don't lose ground and the investments that have been made and fall out of our progress towards the 2030 goal of bringing this epidemic under control. Our fear is that if we do not fill those gaps urgently, we will see again, unintended death and new infections that will set us back. So I'll stop there, Dr. Abba, to explain where we've come from, what we had and what we've lost, and perhaps what we need to do as a nation to ensure that the damage is not greater than what it could be should we not act. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I think a real call for us to get our act together in the face of such huge challenges. So really appreciate that. And I hope, so colleagues, if you can put your questions in for Linda Gale as quickly as you can, because she will need to slip out a little bit before the finish of the webinar. Wandile Sihlobo, a good friend and fellow columnist in the Business Day, and Chief Economist at the Agricultural Business Chamber of South Africa. Over to you, Wandile.
Thanks, Abba. That's very kind. And good morning to all of the folks that are joining us online on this webinar. Abba, I imagine that you asked that I join in here because of the agricultural prominence in this discussion, especially from an economic trade perspective with the US. But let me take a few minutes and make some remarks here, because I think from a trade perspective, the numbers are well known. The possibility of an extension of AGOA, or if it is terminated, those have all been debated there, but suffice to underscore the point that our engagement through this program is unilateral. Of course, the US offering us the duty-free access for a range of commodities in South Africa and some products. But I think while when you're looking at on a numbers perspective, it may seem small, there are some sectors that are would be hardest hit if we were to be outside of this. Let me give you an example of the one that I'm sitting in, which is the agricultural sector. Our exports, for example, to the US, they only account for about 4%. We send out to the world about $13.7 billion of agricultural products a year. And then the US is 4% of that. A large part of our products, almost half, is to the African continent. And then you have 20% EU, 21% Asia and the Middle East, and the other parts of the world. But that 4% is concentrated in some of the most important industries in our sector and certain provinces. That's certainly citrus, nuts, wine, grapes. So if we were to lose out on a duty-free access, assuming nothing bad happens, and then we get to most favored nations tariffs, those will mean that we face about a 3% tariff rate, which doesn't necessarily mean our product won't enter the US market, but in terms of competitiveness, they wouldn't be competitive. And of course, then if we are hit by the largest tariffs, that has various implications then even within that access to the US. But I think the ambassador in his remarks makes some important observation there to say this unilateral engagement with the US perhaps maybe may not be as sustainable for the long term. He highlighted a couple of risks there, and I think there was about 4 of those. The first one, starting back in 2015, when we were engaging with the US about the whole renewal of AGOA at the time. They had raised the issue of poultry, issues of pork, and all of that, and gave us really a hard time before they could let South Africa in. The second part was again around the intellectual property rights issue in 2020, the Lady R issues, the Middle East matters, and of course the dynamics within the BRICS. All of this to say, there are a couple of risks on this relationship that we are having with the US. Perhaps pivoting to a new direction may be a useful thing. both for securing our relationship long term, the tunnel that you are referring to, Ambassador, but I think most importantly for predictability, even for businesses. And I'm speaking as one of the workers in the business space in South Africa. I think in terms of the predictability of what we are doing, it's always something that we appreciate. And then on our side, we think that the new direction that the South African lawmakers should be taking to the table whenever that engagement happens is really thinking about how can we find a bilateral engagement with the US and come out of what we are having, which is a unilateral engagement. And I think some of the comments that have come out of the presidency, you saw the Vincent commenting on the New York Times, and the president himself has made some of these comments, which are somewhat pointing towards a possibility of a free trade agreement whenever the opportunity presents. But I think that's what, as South Africa, we have to try to negotiate with the US. Of course, that carries its own risk because it means that there will be winners and losers amongst the certain industries in South Africa. But I think for those industries that get to be at an advantageous position, we would have some moment of predictability of what we are doing. So in essence, given those risks that were there, the importance of AGOA for certain industries, but also thinking about the long-term sustainability of what we are having economically, I think that beyond the chaos and some of the geopolitical noise that we are experiencing, South Africa should be thinking about that long-term trade engagement with the US. And I think as that is happening, Abba, we do need also to pay a lot of attention with opening as many export markets as possible in other parts of the world. Yes, the US is the second largest after China. I'm not now speaking about agriculture, I'm speaking broadly about the economy, but I think South Africa needs to strengthen relationships broadly. And again, to remarks that have been made by Prof now, as well as those remarks that were made by the ambassador, having your tentacles as well as just the links across the world is somewhat hedging against some of these risks and the noise and unpredictability that we are having now. In the agricultural sector specifically, we have deep interest about strengthening and deepening our trade with BRICS. Right now, there are higher tariffs within the BRICS countries, as well as the phytosanitary barriers. So economically, BRICS in agriculture even only makes up about 8% of our agricultural exports, which is almost equal to what we send to the UK. So we want then to see if there could be a deeper economic and intra-trade within that grouping of BRICS. And of course, even beyond the BRICS countries, the broader Middle East is exciting for agriculture in South Africa. The broader Asia is an exciting area, while at the same time retaining what we have in the African continent as well as the EU. And I think that's the approach that we are currently sitting with at this point. But this will mean then also even just a general feel of change amongst the officials at the Department of Trade and Industry in South Africa, as well as the officials in agriculture, because I think we now need people that are more agile, and perhaps maybe we do have people that are skilled, and we need people that are even more skilled now on economic diplomacy as well as on a trade aspect in these departments that will carry us through this. And I think whatever engagement that we will be having with the world, the government, of course, does lead some of these, but I think it has to be done concurrently with business, because at the end of the day, there has to be all of that alignment between our business activities as well as what on the economic diplomacy part we take forward in engaging with the world on that. And I think this balances again to the earlier remarks that you yourself, Chair, made about the values as well as the economic interest that we need to have as the world. But let me close with one point for the benefit of the colleagues that are online, which is that in all of our engagement as the Agricultural Business Chamber of South Africa across the country, the farmers are enthusiastic. They want to stick in and stay in South Africa. And at this moment, they are actually farming and doing excellently we have a sector that has more than doubled in value and in volume terms since 1994. There is no siege of land or a sector that is under pressure. And in fact, if anything, which is the message that even our colleagues at AgriSA were saying, they are as shocked as you are, Chair, when you read about these things that people allege are happening in South Africa. So if anything, they are looking at strengthening these ties and growing our farming economy. And thanks for the opportunity to speak.
Thank you very much, Wandile. Really appreciate bringing in that perspective, and you've stuck absolutely to the brief, exactly the kind of inputs we needed. So the third panelist is Professor Daniel Bradlaugh, a good friend as well, who's now currently Senior Research Fellow at the Center for Advanced Scholarship at the University of Pretoria. And Daniel, I think you've been looking at international financial systems, writing about them, analyzing them, enlightening us about them. Really looking forward to hear what you've got to add to this discussion. Thanks.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Omar. Thank you, and thank you to MISTRA for inviting me, and to everyone for listening. I want to make a couple of points. One is, as was said at the beginning, Trump has only been in office for 50 days, for less than 2 months, with a lot of drama and a lot of noise. And it's not yet clear exactly what exactly the end result of all this will be. But I think we can say that the direction of travel seems to be fairly clear. And a couple of points just about what he's doing, and then I'll go into more detail in terms of international affairs. One is, I think it's always important when dealing with the US from South Africa to remember South Africa occupies an unusual position in relation to the US because of its own complicated and tragic race relations history, that they always see us in a sense as a mirror reflecting something about them. And I think the debates or the discussions now about the Afrikaners and DEI issues is a symptom of that. And I think we should keep that in mind as we think about how America is going to affect us in the future. Second thing is, all the actions that are being taken now affects Africa profoundly, as the USAID PEPFAR discussion we heard before mentions. But it's also important to keep in mind that Africa is collateral to the major focus of what the US is trying to do. If you look at all the discussions about the tariffs, and there's noise about the tariffs at the moment because Trump is so erratic in threatening to raise tariffs, lower them, etc. Most of that is aimed at the US's major allies in the global north. Its allies in North America, or its allies in Europe. Africa gets affected indirectly by most of that. So that's a second point to make. Third point is much of the attack that is becoming more clear, but is getting less of the attention, is the US's attack on international institutions and the functioning of the international financial system. The US has pulled out of a number of international organizations, the World Health Organization. It's pulled out of the COP negotiations. It's threatening to pull out of other UN agencies. It's begun a review of its involvement with the international financial institutions, particularly the World Bank and the IMF. Where that leads is not yet clear, but I think we need to think seriously about what the implications of that could be. First point to note in that regard is that this is not new and did not begin with President Trump. The attack on the World Trade Organization from the US really began under President Obama, who was the first president to block an appointment of someone to the appellate body in the dispute settlement procedures of the WTO. President Biden was the person who froze the assets of the Central Bank of Russia, attacking one of the fundamental pillars, in a way, of the international financial system. And so that what Trump is doing is really building on a process that had begun earlier in earlier administrations, which is really questioning whether the international system that the US created after the Second World War is really working for the United States, and whether it wants to see that system continue. I think it's important in that regard to remember that this is not the first time the US has attacked the basis of the international financial and economic order. President Nixon in 1971 broke the link between the US dollar and gold and ended the Bretton Woods system that the US had created in 1944. It did that, throwing the world into a lot of turmoil at the time. It took another 8 years approximately for the international system to re-establish a new international monetary order, an international monetary order that was based and is still based on fiat currency and the dollar. The second attack was when President Reagan came to power. Soon after he came to power, he made statements to the effect that the IMF no longer served a useful purpose and thought should be given to shutting down the IMF. In 1982, Mexico defaulted on its debt, and a year later, President Reagan was talking about how critically important the IMF was to the functioning of the global financial system and that it needed to increase its resources, which I think is a useful reminder that with all the noise going on now, things could change depending on how events unfold. But where does that leave us, and how should we respond to all of this? I would say it's obvious that there are threats that are arising out of this. They're threats that we need to take extremely seriously. We're really in the process now of testing, or thanks to President Trump's actions, we are testing to what extent the US is still the hegemonic power in the world and how far its power goes. It's still, from an economic point of view, it still accounts for about 26% of the global economy in nominal terms, about 15% in PPP terms, as the US dollar is still central to the functioning of the international financial system. It's involved, about 58% of international reserves are held in the dollar. The dollar is involved in about 64% of international debt is denominated in dollars. About over 80% of foreign exchange transactions involve the dollar. So it's still very important. The US military is still the most powerful in the world, but we're about to see how far that power actually goes in the sense that Trump is trying to bully the world, in a sense, into adapting to his view of how things should be run. So that threat has to be taken seriously, but I think we also have to be aware that there are opportunities for changing the world embedded in this as well, but with the proviso that we need to be very clear-eyed on what those opportunities are and how best to exploit them. I always think it's a warning to look at what was the fate of the new international economic order in the 1970s. As soon after President Nixon had ended the Bretton Woods system, the global south of those days began to move to create a new international economic order, beginning successfully in the UN to introduce a number of resolutions that suggested change in that order. But within a few years, the global north had responded and changed that. And we ended up with the financial system that we have now. Now, however, I think if we form alliances, we think how to diversify our economy, to develop new trade relations, as was said, to rethink how we relate to the US as an important trading partner. If we think what are the issues that are most important to Africa, but also to countries in the global north, in Europe, there's a possibility for change on issues like debt, climate, development, food security, that there's space for some change now. And I think we should work to exploit those as we can now. And with that, let me stop. Thank you.
Perfect, Danny. Thank you very much. I'm going to ask Naeem if there are any. I see there are a few comments and questions on HIV/AIDS. So if you could quickly raise that so that Professor Linda Gale Becker can address that before she slips out through the back door.
Ava, just to say that that Linda Gale has actually replied, I think, to all the questions addressed to her.
Okay. Anything else you'd
yeah.
like to add, Linda, before you depart?
No, I think one point I do want to make is that whilst we've received this aid, and of course it's been critical to our well-being in our program, it is bi-directional. We have exported excellent understanding and knowledge of how to treat HIV and tuberculosis that has benefited the global community, including our neighbors in the United States of America. And of course, this has strengthened health systems in a way that we've been able to do other work. So our response to the COVID epidemic was largely, sort of on the back of what we have been able to achieve through HIV and AIDS in this country. So, I do want to say that our path towards complete reliance on the national fiscus was a good one. And I think it is around us being able to weather this really traumatic time of making sure we don't lose ground. But I think there is opportunity for us to get onto the other side stronger than we were before if we do this strategically. And I made some comments about that in the question and answer. So thank you for the opportunity.
I'm muted before everyone screams at me. Thank you for being here. Really appreciate your input and your responses. So Naeem, give us a flavor of the questions and what people are saying in the chat.
Yeah, it's been a bit overwhelming. I'm trying
That's why I'm asking you to do it.
I'm trying to keep pace and not really succeeding. But just as a flavor before getting into specific things, first, because I like to start with something funny, an anonymous comment for Ambassador Rasool. Ambassador Rasool's analysis of the US may be correct. However, he's doing South Africa no service by speaking this way. His job is to represent South African interests in Washington, not to be a left-wing militant, Ambassador Rasool. A number of the questions relate to the theme of should we start thinking differently? Should we think in a way as South Africa, in a way that we no longer dependent on aid for anything, including HIV/AIDS. Also in terms of our trade, exports, etc. Should we become more self-sufficient? Should we dump AGOA or not care if we get dumped out of AGOA and focus rather on the African Continental Free Trade Agreement? So a number of the questions and comments around this kind of idea of self-sufficiency. Shall I go on to some of the specific questions, Abba?
Yes, sorry.
Okay. Okay, so there's a number of questions, and some of them are to specific speakers. I'll note those. When I don't note specific speakers, it's for Ambassador Rasool. So here's one from Anthea. Given the radicalness of these actions, do you think it's too extreme and that there will be a backlash strong enough to lead to the current trajectory imploding, markets crashing, etc.? And from the same person, a question to Wandile Sihlobo. Should South Africa, and this is just an example of this kind of question, should South Africa be focusing on securing other trading partners and weaning ourselves off the US, given the unpredictability? Ashraf asks, is it, and again to Ambassador Rasool, it's false consensus to cite Europe as an ally to South Africa and Africa. As you know, EU core states have announced major cuts in development aid and are now increasing military budgets. Hence, less development resources for meeting our UN SDG agenda and also less chance for Africa debt relief. So pushback on that Europe issue. Kas Kuvadia, who's been very active on our, well, he's very active generally, but very active here, asks, any comments on the view that if we work through the noise, this actually what's happening in the US is grand state capture and a transactional approach to benefit just an elite. Your thoughts as well. Ambassador Rasool, let me just say that some of these are not Cass's questions in particular, but some of the questions are not meant to be answered by a diplomat. I'll ask them anyway, just so that we all get a taste of what's being asked. Cass also asks your thoughts on balancing out a values-based approach and maintaining relationships with the USA, which is, like it or not, still a major trade and investment source. Cass also agrees with Professor Bradlow, that Trumpism presents new opportunities. In the B20, that's the business 20 environment, we are seeing, he says, new alliances between North and South that we need to develop. Then a question on whether you think AGOA will be renewed. Moatlodi Pitse, who's also been very active. Is the current US policy position towards South Africa not an opportunity for South Africa to find its feet and look more internally, etc.? Again, that same kind of tone. Natasha Marian from Financial Mail, 2 questions. First, from your input, Ambassador Rasool, it sounds as if South Africa's strategy is to allow the Trump administration to settle first before sending in a high-level delegation or even envoys. Is this correct? Can you provide potential timelines for this? And second question, Semaphore reported that the ambassador is battling to secure, that Ambassador Rasool is battling to secure crucial meetings in Washington as South Africa seeks to mend relations with the Trump administration. Can you confirm or elaborate on this? Very journalisty question. Mike Sirame asks, is there a place for inherent values that anchors our foreign policy posture, such as non-mercantilism, progressive internationalism, Pan-Africanism, global solidarity, etc., in this evolving global geopolitical order? Ambassador Rasool's reference to the framework document on South Africa's national interest points to this, but I'll let him respond. Nana asks or says, it's very impressive to see the EU stepping up and strategizing as a collective on security, tariffs, and other issues. To what extent is this happening in Africa, either at the level of EU or the REX? Raymond Willemse, how is South Africa adapting to the US administration's shift towards using social media instead of official diplomatic channels for communication? Is this now more challenging to convey South Africa's position to US officials? Raymond doesn't say so, but I'm wondering whether this means that South Africans are particularly bad at social media. Why does it seem, he also asks, that the US is sidelining South Africa in diplomatic engagements while actively engaging with our neighboring countries, such as Botswana and Eswatini? Professor Edwin Igioma, Ambassador Rasool's experience in the US and global diplomacy has been outstanding, and his suggested approaches to handling the impasse is a welcome development. How do you deal with the present Hydra-headed policy approach that defiles all forms of basic and high-level diplomatic engagements with South Africa and many other countries? Ronesh Dauraj asks a question that I think many people are asking. If South Africa had to scrap its ICJ case against Israel, will all our current problems with the US disappear? Stan Molema, and this is a question to Wandile, is this current situation not an opportunity, again, that tone, to look at being self-reliant? And John Peters, similar kind of question. Gordon Africa makes a few comments, and Ambassador, I think it's not a question, but it's useful to make these points for you and the audience. He starts by saying respectfully, and whenever someone starts like that, you know it's not going to be. Respectfully, Gordon Africa says, President Trump is farting against the wind. First point. Our exports to the US amounts to 14.7 billion, imports from the US 5.8 billion. We should apply tariffs tit for tat. Number 2, apply increased tariffs at our harbors on trade routes, choking access to our value chains. 3, our critical minerals essential to US economy, and the critical minerals that are essential to the US economy, a large proportion of it comes from South Africa. And just to add, for example, chromium ores, they import 98% of the imports are from South Africa, platinum 37%, etc. Number 4, BRICS is a game changer that should lead de-dollarization and provide access to new markets and less dependence on AGOA. 5, target the hundreds of American companies in South Africa, restrain the benefits they derive to counterbalance AGOA threats. Yep. 6, we should make a special effort to service all HIV beneficiaries using our own resources. 7, build relations with EU that can open new markets. We should not be bullied, he says. Simon Ellison from the continent asks Ambassador Rasool, on a personal level, another very journalist question, on a personal level, what kind of reception have you received from officials in the Trump administration? I'm coming to the end soon, Abba. Bandile Hadebe, again, should we not look at this as an opportunity to accelerate the African continental free trade area, etc.? Would you agree, Matlodi Pizza asks, that our major challenge as Africa, including South Africa, is that we adopted a dependency entitlement mindset that distracts from finding homegrown solutions? Sam Molema says, Ambassador, it doesn't appear to me like South Africa has a risk analysis and mitigation plan. For Professor Bradlow from Helmut Pierce, is Trump following the Heritage Foundation's Project 2025 playbook? TK Pue asks, is our national interest, the framework document, has it failed to address the global shifting order over the past 15 years? TK Pue, that document is from 2 years ago. And that's it. I'm going to stop there. There are a few other comments, Abba, but I see you sending me frantic messages.
No, thank you very much. And for some of us who are struggling to keep up with all the comments and the questions, you've done a brilliant job. So we'll retain you for future webinars as well. If you don't mind, as we agreed, I'll ask Wandile to start first in responding to some of the issues raised, and then Prof. Bradlow, and then I'll ask Ambassador Rasool to respond and wrap up. So I'll give you guys about Wandile and Bradlow about 6-8 minutes, and then that gives Ambassador Rasool about another 10 minutes or so to respond and wrap up. I think a lot of people are going to want to hear all your comments, so don't think everything is left for Ambassador Rasool. Do comment on it, even if it's outside your immediate domain. Thank you very much.
I see what you're doing there. You are talking to me so that I don't focus only on agriculture. But look, I'll give the ambassador. He has stayed up to be with us the other 5 minutes in that 8 minutes. But let me just be brief on the two things, both on our efforts on export diversification as to how economically we should be engaging the U.S. First, on the US one, it's not clear to me if it would be an ideal way to antagonize the US. We talk here at a high level about the trade figures, and they can be misleading because you will cite 2%, 4%, whatever figure that you have, depending on the product that you are looking at. But the reality is that between America and South Africa, there's a lot of deep investment that are happening in the businesses. If I were to make an example again of the sector that we are in agriculture, we send out $13.7 billion. Exports to the US are about 4% of that. But if you look at our value chain as to who is investing a lot in machinery, you have the lot of companies that are in the machinery, a lot of companies that are in the seed business, in agribusinesses, and a whole range of things that we do. So the interdependence and the linkages between these economies are fairly strong. So I wouldn't think it's a useful thing to disentangle. And I do think, again, we must be perhaps maybe keep it at the back of our mind that these are things of the moment. There is life after 4 years. And we don't know what will happen after 4 years. This is all to say that in our thinking, there's a lot of short-term friction and noise flooding the zone, as Bannon calls it. But I think thereafter we should have a long-term approach in here. So which is why I'm of the viewpoint that the AGOA issues near term, but we should be looking at the long-term trade matters. We should also not underestimate the fact that South Africa in 2014 had already reached a level where we were somewhat an upper middle income country, where technically you were not qualifying to be one of those countries that are given the unilateral aid, access in the US that we are getting.
Sorry, Wandile, someone's saying they can't, I also struck me a little bit to hear you. I'm not sure if you've moved away from your mic or closer.
No, I'm still in the same
That's
position.
better.
I hope they
That's
can
better.
hear me.
Yeah.
So the point I was making on is that the other thing we must remember is that even in 2014, when we went on to negotiate, South Africa was already somewhat an upper middle income country where we were not technically qualifying to be part of AGOA. So what is happening now is adding to some of those realities that are there, which is why I think the useful way for South Africa is to look for a long-term sustainable way of engaging with the US, but distangling the US and saying, oh, I will go and focus elsewhere in the world. I don't think it's an ideal thing to do, economically speaking. The second part that I think we can do concurrently is, of course, then this expansion and diversification to other parts of the world. And that is not going to be an easy path. Back in the 2000s, when everyone was going on about globalization, it was easier, relatively easier, not technically, relatively easier to get all of these trade agreements. But I think since COVID-19, we have all learned that everyone is looking inwards to a certain extent. So opening up export markets is not an easy path to walk, but I think South Africa will have to do that, which is why I made the comment that staffing the DIRCO, the Economic Diplomacy Unit, with people who have a sharp and a keen economic interest for business and the country specifically is a vital thing to do by the minister that side. The minister at the DTIC needs to do the same thing and have people that will technically be focusing on these things: export diversification, securing what we have, and another team that is looking at these things. But I do want to underscore that let's not allow the moment of today to take all of our effort and put onto one country without spreading our energy to engage as many parts of the world as possible. And I think this links to Cass's point that there's goodwill and conversation, somewhat a coalition of the wounded that is coming up in these engagement. And let's take advantage of that, while at the same time, it's very useful that we don't antagonize the US. I don't know what politics play out, but economically, there are strong links. It would be a mistake to do that. Let me stop there. Thanks.
Thank you very much for that. Really appreciate it. And I think, also echoing some of the ambassador's sentiment that, stay calm. Let's think these issues through, keep the long term in mind as well. Professor Bradlow, over to you.
Thanks, Abba. So to respond to a few of the points, the first one on the self-sufficiency point and on Africa, I think it's absolutely essential that South Africa prioritize intercontinental relations, particularly around the African Continental Free Trade Agreement as a way of expanding our economic relations. But I think it's also important, we haven't talked today about the fact that we're going through a technological revolution as well, and that there are factors at work in the global economy which suggest we can't rely just on an Africa focus. We have to think about how do we link into supply chains and access to technology from around the world, so that our strategy, I think, has to be broader, but that Africa must be central to that as our home region. That's point number one. Point number two, on the question on debt relief and whether the developments now make debt relief more or less likely for African countries. I think we have to start, in a sense, from the point that the truth is that the African debt situation, as difficult as it is and as important as it is for us, is not systemically important, in the sense that if Africa defaulted on its entire debt, the global economy would go on just fine. The total debt is about $800 billion in a global financial system that's in something like the $300 trillion range. So that it's really not a very significant portion, but that's an opportunity as well. And in a sense, when I was talking about having to form tactical alliances on particular issues, the debt is an issue where there's a real possibility. The debt is a very destabilizing force in many countries in Africa. As many of us know, there are many countries that are spending more servicing their debt than on health, education, infrastructure in Africa. That means the prospects for growth in Africa are limited. That means the risk of increased migration into Europe from Africa, of destabilizing forces are not insignificant. And it's in Europe's interests as well as Africa's interest to work out a sustainable solution to the debt. I think we know that the current arrangements don't work very well and that there needs to be much more creative thinking about how we deal with the debt issue. But it's an issue that can be dealt with and can be linked to issues like funding for climate issues, the loss and damage debate, the SDG debates. So I think we need to focus on that as an opportunity if we think carefully and tactically about that. And just as a footnote to that, is to remember the last time there was debt relief was in the Jubilee 2000 campaign, which was really a global alliance that involved creditors, debtors, private sector, civil society, governments. And so there's scope for something like that before. On the BRICS issue, someone mentioned the importance of BRICS, and there's no question that BRICS is important, and it's important for us going forward in this new world. But I think we have to be clear-eyed about BRICS as well. I think it was a very unfortunate development that at the G20 finance ministers meeting in Cape Town recently, India, China, and Brazil chose not to send their finance ministers to the meeting. It wasn't just the US that didn't do it. And while I'm sure there were very good reasons why each of them chose not to come, the fact that they didn't see it as important to show solidarity with South Africa at a moment of where the G20 as well as South Africa was under pressure is not an encouraging sign in this regard. I think the discussion on de-dollarization in BRICS, to be blunt, is a complete pipe dream. As the figures I gave you, the important role of the dollar is just too significant for us to imagine that in the foreseeable future, that role could collapse completely. There is no real substitute. The next closest currency is the euro, which is less than half the role that the dollar plays. The Chinese currency is important and growing, but it's still got a long way to go. Final point on Project 2025 in the US. I mean, I think it's an important document. It clearly is influencing a lot of what the Trump administration is doing. It's a sign that they spent 4 years plotting what they would do when they came to power. When you look at I've looked only at the portions dealing with the international financial institutions, and it's clear that there's a lot of work that's been put into that. But I have to say, every time I look at that, I'm reminded of Mike Tyson's comment that everyone has a plan until the first punch in the nose. And I think when this plan confronts reality, it's going to prove less feasible than it might seem initially. I think I'll stop there and give the ambassador more time.
Thank you very much, Danny. Really appreciate that, and keeping that broader perspective that we need to have when looking at US South Africa or US Africa relation. So, Ambassador, I think your fellow panelists have allocated you a lot of time, and the chat have also asked you a lot of questions. And I know this is one of those weird things of this kind of format, that you're really under pressure to look at so many different issues, and I'm sure you have so many things that you want to impart. So please feel free. I'll give you another 15 minutes to go for it. If you need a reminder, I'll appear at the 15th minute. Thank you. Over to you.
No, thank you. Thank you very much, Abba, and thank you very much to everybody for staying the course and for asking as many questions as possible. Let me start with something that came up in the chat that said that the ambassador is too generic. When you're sitting with an audience as mixed and as hybrid as this, including journalists, this is not the audience where you begin to speak about the deep strategy that is being used, the detail of the work, and all of those kind of things. I think what one wants to do is to begin to say that we are making sense of the situation. You begin to say that in the sense making of the situation, we have in the last 4 weeks surveyed all shades of opinion on the Hill, through targeting over 20 officers and representatives and senators, and with a specific thing about what the issues are that they believe would ease the relationship and reset and rebuild the relationship between South Africa and the USA. And so it's out of that one gets a sense of the geopolitical hot button issues and where they rank on the hierarchy of issues that must be solved, and where they stand and what the shades of opinion are on the hard issues from aid to trade and multilateral funding and so forth. So I think we've gotten through a lot of that. And so we're in the process of putting this together. Does it mean South Africa did not have a risk mitigation strategy? Did Canada have one? Did the EU have one? Because we must, if you underestimate and we join the kind of appellation of President Trump as a buffoon and all of those kind of things, you make the cardinal mistake of underestimating at least the impact of what is being done and where it comes from and what it is aimed at. So I think South Africa does not want to fall into that kind of trap, because we are on full alert. Every day, my staff works out whatever the implications are of every executive order, and they're over 100 already, and so forth. So I think we're trying to really make sense of it. Is our strategy to wait and watch? I don't think we're waiting, but we are watching. I think we are engaging every day, and again, it is not engaging empty doors or settling for low-level people, but really creating the foundation for an engagement at high levels when they are filled. And I don't think there is an appreciation of the fact that Senate is still confirming people into their positions, and therefore I think we need to be able to really be strategic in how we deploy. Now, the question of when, for example, envoys are deployed, our job is to facilitate the access. It is the president's job and prerogative to dispatch the envoys at the right moment, but most importantly, with the right wherewithal to come through. And the fact that we're getting into the wherewithal is a very, very important issue, because we can't afford, given the expectations of 60 million people in South Africa, we can't afford to make a simple binary of our options. As Wandile said, that this is not a moment to antagonize the United States. What it is, because the binary options about, oh, let's go for self-reliance. Of course, we must build our self-reliance, but it's a process. There is, and on the other hand, let's put all our eggs in BRICS. Let's get into, we have enough leverages to get into a tariff and trade war. I think that we need to be able to understand what's on the other side of the AGOA agreements, what's on the other side on the GSP, because we can say, let's forfeit AGOA and go for GSP. The GSP issues will then be subjected to tariffs. And there's a capricious approach to what level of tariffs are going to be imposed. So there's no escaping from one regime of trade to another, because there's ways in which Canada does not have AGOA, etc. But they are being subjected to those kind of things, and they're doing a comprehensive thing. So by and large, the 2nd of April is when the Trump administration will announce the next round of countries that are going to be targeted for tariffs. And we're looking at how we do that. And of course, our trade and industry and competition department, we are every day doing our scenario planning, doing our risk mitigation, doing the things of finding new markets, doing the speeding up of the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, building self-reliance, etc., etc. But the point of the matter is every process needs a bridge. You cannot operate with the idea of a guillotine. So I really want to say, let us not get into binary thinking on this matter. It has to be an all of the above situation. And I really think that we must avoid the things that cocks a snoot at the USA. De-dollarization. Not even China is speaking any longer about de-dollarization. Russia certainly isn't speaking about de-dollarization, because not only is that a performative issue at this moment, it's not practical. It does not economically make sense for us to even breathe that, and certainly will invoke the kind of punitive immediate measures that would come. And so I think we're asking for a very smart approach on all of these things. We are, and I don't want to get into yes and no answers about will AGOA be renewed. We want it to be renewed, but we need contingencies. And so let's not get into the details of what the planning is, but certainly I think our objectives are certainly in place. I did not imply that when I said that new allies are made. I don't think that we have allies that we share universally our values with and universally our interests with and so forth. I think, again, we must avoid all or nothing kind of things. If the EU can't agree with us on this and keep their funds flowing, then they are not an ally. Sometimes there are strength in numbers, that there are common victimhoods that must be turned into agency, and more uniformed pushback against what is coming. And either or and yes or no, in or out thinking is what can be done in other circles, but not in circles that take the lives of 60 million people into their hands. And that really, I think, is a very important one. And in much the same way, the reason I opened up with the provocation about values and interests is, again, we must not see values and interests as binary issues, because to sustain a human rights culture in South Africa may look like a very values-based thing, but it needs you to put food on the table in every household in order for people not to feel that they are suffering because of a human rights solidarity-based approach. On the other hand, every interest has a value foundation, because what looks like a trade interest creates jobs in South Africa and puts food on the table, which by itself is a laudable value. So again, I think we are beginning to understand what are the hierarchy of values and interests, and how do we find the perfect middle between them in order for us not to be forced into trade-off positions. And so, for example, one of the non-negotiables I've come here to Washington with, and that I have spoken about significantly, and I think even my engagements with people in the emerging Trump administration are beginning to say, we understand your kind of bottom line on the ICJ, but let's get rid of peripheral issues. And so I think we're beginning to make those kind of penetrations in order that we would be able to push forward. But we're not going to give, because we are not in the performative in which we want to show what we are doing. We are in the performance which is founded on outcomes. And we would want to not video every performative what we would want to report would be the performance. What are we delivering and what are we putting together? And so in that way, I think if I'm guarded, it's because of those kind of things, and it is. And we can be in denial as much as what we want to be, but there is a difference in our exports to China and our exports to the USA. Our exports to China are 80% commodity-based. Our exports to the US are 70% manufactured. The one comes with an enormous number of jobs. And so, again, the fact of the matter is you don't trade off East and West, because the one drives you higher on the development trajectory. The other one helps you significantly with your GDP. But we need to be able to get a deal going in which the one who is more capable of beneficiating are the kind of investors we need to attract. And so I think we've got to not get into the kind of binary thinking that sometimes when we are upset and watching some of these things, you can be tempted into. And I think that there are other questions about non-conventional diplomacy. I think that that goes with the nature of turning around the conventional, the incumbency that I'm speaking about. So we have to watch social media. You can't have a principled position because you now know that that's where you are going to get the earliest sign of what's going on. And we do that. We've got a team in the embassy whose job it is to scour that and to put out an early warning system. And so we were very happy that we were not, for example, on the kind of adversarial state list, which means that that was a major improvement from the sentiment, and it comes from engagement in the right quarters. But I think we are adjusting to the unconventional way in which these things are happening. I want to just quickly mention, because I think here's a signal case about how South Africa is the standard bearer, for example, of building self-reliance over a fairly rapid period of time, less than 2 decades, in which, for example, almost 2 decades ago, our input into HIV funding was near zero, and PEPFAR was near 100%. In 2025, PEPFAR is 17%, and the South African government is 83%. That's a success story. And that's a story that says the bridge is almost reaching the other side. How do we manage it? And if that's the kind of approach that I think we begin to have in our scenario planning, I think we have a way forward. Peter Fabricius, the issue of the Zelensky effect is not the standoff on critical minerals. What we are saying is you are the kind of public display that we saw in the White House is not what you subject your people to with unprepared ways to go into a transactional negotiation with the White House. You've got to be there. You've got to send the signal that we are considering it. We've got our top lines. We've got our bottom lines. Let's open the discussion. There's nothing wrong with that negotiation. We do it in everyday life, and we've probably now just got to adjust to that being the currency of it. And so it is not about selling off and giving away critical minerals. It's how we understand our leverages within this and how we are going to access that. It's on the geopolitical issues. It's what signals we can send, but also being very mindful of our bottom lines that we have spoken about, like the ICJ. And then I think the last one, which I believe has enjoyed some traction, is the issue about the more personal dimensions of it. I must say I've not thought that what I've said sounded like left-wing militancy and so forth. I think that's playing to a trope that is out there. I think I fear more that people that I've been associated with historically may thought that I'm too soft in being pragmatic. So I'm glad that only one person mentioned it. But the idea, for example, that if you don't make visible the performative about your engagements, that you are not getting access. I think that when you get access, you shut up because you've got to nurture it. You don't conduct the kind of fate of 60 million people on television, on video, on social media. That would be absolutely irresponsible. And then you have a reason to recall me because I'm playing silly buggers with the fortunes of our nation. And I think that the way in which, and I must say the way in which the presidency, DIRCO, DTIC, agriculture, and others have conducted themselves have been with absolute dignity. That's what makes South Africa different. Our president can stand up in the State of the Nation address and say, we will not be bullied. And he will get pushback, but he will get respect because they feel the need to push back on a moral position that is asserted. And that's the line we take as we go forward in this. The president is under pressure. Send your invoice, send your invoice. And the president says, I will do it at the strategic time. This is a man who understood the strategy of the moment in our transition. He understood the urgency of the moment when the ANC went to 40% and the formation of the government of national unity needed to be done. And so let's continue to trust that strategic judgment because there is enormous input that is coming from critical departments in government. And I want to say, unfortunately, we cannot feed the performative beast. Too much is at stake. We want to be able to announce the performance-related issues. And the performance-related issues is judged not by process, but by outcome. And we sometimes don't have media that says, oh, how did South Africa dodge the bullet of adversarial state alongside Iran and others when the whole world was expecting that we may be adversarial state number one? Do they think it just happened out of that he forgot to write it? Some work must have gone into it. And so sometimes news must be deductive and not always inductive. Analysis must sometimes overcome announcement. And I really think that I know it's a wonderful media landscape filled with tropes and filled with opinion and filled with everything. But at the end of the day, I am feeling very confident that not that we will succeed, because this is uncharted waters, unconventional means of communication. But I feel confident that we are up for the game and that we are every day at work on this. I must tell you, if Trump has been in office for 50 days, I have been in office for 50 days. And this time around. And I think I've got an average of more meetings on the Hill than many other ambassadors. I get invited to a significant number of think tank engagements. The obverse, and I'll end on this, Abba, the obverse is that South Africa looks like it is under the whip, but the curiosity effect to hear what makes us different is working for us. That even the administration reaches out to us now and to say, we need to engage. And so I really want to end it there. We're not going to compete with a Kali and a Ernst and everyone else. They've had their turn. They were found to have feet of clay. And when they came with feet of clay to Washington, and they tried to, there was less access. But the fact of the matter is, we've got to show firm feet, up for the game, confident about our bottom lines, and open to negotiate our top lines. That really is the only way to get into this and be transactional. It's not a swear word. Values will always be there, but transactionality, I've learned, is not going to be a swear word unless it's a cover for larceny. And we will not open South Africa to larceny. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you very much, Ambassador Rasool. I'm sure you wouldn't have had a chance to see this one comment that I'd like to read from Skalkberger, who says that Ambassador Rasool gives me hope and evidence that South Africa's international relations are becoming more mature and sophisticated to our benefit. So thank you, Skalk, from Engineering News. Really appreciate your input. We really appreciate Wandile, Danny, Sandy, and Linda Gale's inputs and responses. And most importantly, we appreciate your presence as an audience. You are what we do our research for. We try and, MISTRA's raison d'etre is to provide public policy processes, some kind of evidence-based research that we can sharpen our responses to the challenges that our country, Africa, and humanity faces. And on that note, I'm going to ask my colleagues to put on the film. That's a bit of a commercial plug. As indicated, it's a really interesting and prescient piece of work. And I think also gives us a sense of what we need to be doing as Africa. Okay, Kotso, Funi. And it's also on the chat if you wish to look at the film at your own. Over to you. Thank you.
We're posing the question, what are the causes of all these tensions and conflicts, and how can Africa ensure that especially great power competition doesn't undermine the continent?
Now, this conference is really important because we need to start making sense of the fundamental changes that we see globally in power relations, from the climate emergency to the unbearable human suffering and escalating violent conflicts to the tech revolution to ultimately this gross inequality that we're seeing globally.
So one of the things about Africa is because we are in the middle, I'm not talking about a map, but in the middle between great powers, we also have potentially a role to mediate how that conflict plays out.
I think it's very important for Africans to engage around questions of how we actually develop opportunities for our respective nations.
We need to now stand away from these imperial projections of power and imperial projections of ideas, and to ask ourselves, where do we stand and how can we take advantage of the situation which allows us to forge a new world?
So I'd like to begin with a statement that was made by U.S. Secretary of State Anthony Blinken, and he states that the post-Cold War era is officially over. Now we are seeing the emergence of new centers of power, which is creating complex and a more dynamic world order.
There's this great saying, when two elephants fight, it's the grass that suffers. The US and China will intensify those competition elements?
This competition presents both opportunities and threats. The first layer is about an Africa that fully appreciates its objective position in the evolving global political economy. The demographic dividend of a youthful population, arable land that is lying fallow, critical minerals that are in high demand, and the continent's geographic location are among the strategic attributes that Africa should fully take advantage of. The biggest part of the economy remains in private hands and not controlled by states. And that being the reality, we need to be looking at how this is going to be engaged. If the growing gap between the richest 1% and the 99% is to be managed.
70% of the continent is under the age of 35. By 2045, Africa will make up 25% of the world's population. The world's military manpower is on the African continent. The people who will be of fighting age, fit, able, energetic enough to be the cannon fodder are Africans. And you see some of that logic playing out in the composition of UN peacekeeping forces. As of last year, around 25% of global peacekeepers come from Africa. There's going to be a need to use conventional arms as much as possible, and you need bodies for that.
South Africa has, I think, about 82% of the global platinum reserves, which is a very important mineral resource required in the automobile industry. Does that constitute power to influence the direction around the world?
The minerals of the future that are predominantly in Africa, the green economy will be powered by minerals from the DRC, cobalt, coltan.
We are building a road from the DRC via Zambia into Mombasa to mine and take coltan out of the continent. Every single cell phone has to have coltan. 60% of the world's deposits of coltan sit in the DRC. Why are we spending 800 million to move it out instead of taking the 800 million and building a factory in the Congo and producing cell phones and graduating engineers in the Congo?
Enhancing regional integration is very important to our strategic interests to actually work more cohesively as sub-regions of the continent and as a continent. It enhances our agency. We do have the largest number of votes within the General Assembly, but that can only be enhanced through concerted regional integration. And that regional integration also has to support the creation of regional value chains.
Since 2000, China's Africa strategy become more comprehensive and effective and more institutionalized.
Think about the fact that Africa's percentage in global trade is only 3%.
I can tell you, if you think about the sub-Saharan Africa's share in global trade, that has actually halved in merchandise exports now from around 3.5% back in the 1980s, 1990s.
What is the African agenda in respect of technology and who shapes it?
When we're talking about tech standards, are we going to adopt US tech standards to be like adopted in Africa? Are we going to subscribe to US tech standards? Are we going to subscribe to Chinese tech standards? We really need to prioritize developing African tech standards that foreign companies must adhere to when operating or investing in our region to avoid technological colonization.
The African continent itself is only responsible for less than 4% of the greenhouse gas emissions that are causing the climate crisis. Developed countries under the Paris Agreement that have historically contributed to the climate crisis, as well as the carbon emissions, are obligated to provide financial support as well as technology to assist developing countries to reduce their own emissions. However, we have seen that this has not been the case.
We are seeing a trend of green colonialism masking as this insidious and nefarious concept known as carbon credits.
The resources that are required in the now declared war at a trade level between the US and China is taking place on this continent. The critical minerals that they are talking about are here. It means in those countries where those critical minerals are, there's going to be trouble going forward.
In as much as Africa is a key voting bloc on the UN, we don't have a permanent seat on the UN Security Council, despite the fact, again, another contradiction, that Africa's, as an agenda item on the UN Security Council, occupies 50 to almost 65% of discussions, especially around the peace and security.
BRICS, in many respects, speaks to non-alignment. It speaks to those principles of South-South cooperation. It has the potential to push for this equitable and more representative institutions that are meant to represent the world as it is.
End of day one. It went very well. Lots and lots of lessons.
My hope for tomorrow is that we're going to actually get to thinking about some of these issues in that more practical sense of what do we do? How do we respond to these problems?
We're looking forward to day two, and we've got the minister coming in, so it will be interesting to hear the new Minister of International Relations, what his take is in terms of these discussions.
We really, really value this opportunity to look at Africa analytically, not just from a perspective of wanting, but from a perspective of seeing how Africa can develop itself.
Our Chinese President Xi also stated on multiple occasions that the so-called Schroeder's trap does not exist in reality. However, if major countries continue to make strategic miscalculations, they could end up creating such traps for themselves. Supporting Africa's development is a shared responsibility of the international community.
The narrative has to be African, the narrative has to be of the global south, the narrative has to be of the developing world. So Africa has to be part of the wider conversation of what is happening. When you look at the Indian Ocean and Pacific Oceans as one contiguous maritime zone, Africa by definition becomes part of that engagement.
African countries have an opportunity to reclaim their agency in world affairs. By insisting on genuine partnership and aligning agreements with regional groupings and continental programs, Africa has to be in the front of the current discussion and lead the engagement on natural resources, particularly critical minerals.
So when you think about critical minerals, crystals, and their value chains, it's something that I think the continent as a whole needs to have a view on and how we approach that.
How can African countries diversify their economies to reduce dependence on commodities and attract foreign investment?
We need to take a much more critical view of middle powers, such as Brazil, Turkey, India, Saudi Arabia, UAE, all of them with very specific economic investment and, I would dare say, extractive agendas.
I think we are geopolitical actors. We shouldn't see ourselves, and I think sometimes we do. We see ourselves almost as having to be reactive.
So I think we have to be very deliberate about the types of foreign direct investment that we allow, but then that has to be buttressed with the ability to build some form of strategic autonomy in the sub-regional.
Africa today is worse off than it was 3 decades ago, because peacekeeping was an instrument that was conceived for wars between states who follow the rules of war, who respect the Geneva Convention, etc. What we forgot is that paradigm has ended. Post 1990, we're dealing with more internal conflicts. Between 2014 and today, a 400% rise in insurgencies across Africa. You've got organized criminal syndicates, drug traffickers, arms traffickers, human traffickers, rife across the continent. And the danger today that what we're seeing is the intersection between the political establishment and organized crime.
So what's our contribution to de-escalating these conflicts? How do we concretely make a contribution towards silencing the guns?
Unless we establish a Pan-African security entity to take care of our own security, we will wake up 10 years from now and find our security in the hands of somebody else.
BRICS must come into the party, because if BRICS is not an implementer and BRICS is just a talking head, we are going nowhere. The challenge has begun. MISTRA, lead.
I feel like we've covered quite a large area of conversation on how to develop strategies, on how to think about the futures that we're experiencing. And I feel like there is room for us to take this work even further in rooms that are important, in rooms that make decisions, and in rooms that will make a difference.
The global south needs to look at the issues that the global north is not looking at, and develop its own competencies in that.
What stood out was, I think, a greater confidence in Africa to look at the world through its own lens rather than the lens of others.
I suppose you can see from my excitement that this is one of the most impressive events that we have hosted as MISTRA. As you know, all that has happened here is meant to inform the book that we'll be publishing on the Thucydides trap. It's one of the best conferences that we have ever had as MISTRA.
So as they say in the movie business, that's all folks. Take care and